Hello there Minerva makers, it is Jo and today I'm here for a quick tutorial on how to add seam allowances to your patterns. Sometimes you may have to add a seam allowance to a pattern if it's one that's on a double pattern sheet, so if something's printed on both sides, sometimes they eliminate the seam allowances to make sure that they can get all of the pieces onto one sheet of paper as a sustainable kind of product. Or you might use a magazine, and that's the same scenario where there's lots of different pieces all printed on paper with different coloured lines for each pattern, so they'll try and keep the shapes down to a minimum, so you will need to add your seam allowances on afterwards. Sometimes indie patterns they don't have the seam allowance included, so that they give you the choice of what seam allowance you would like to use. Seam allowances are there to join your two pieces together. You'll find on Big 4 patterns that it's 1.5 centimetres, and that gives you a little bit of room for fitting. On others you'll find it's just 1 centimetre, and that is to sew the seams together, and on lingerie patterns you'll find it's sometimes just 6 millimetres. If you want to know more about seam allowances, you can check out my tutorial here and you'll find a little bit out about seam allowances and how to use them. But if you want to measure them, then stay here and I'll show you a few quick tips. You might change seam allowances on a pattern if you're going to sew your garment on a serger, and a serger has a smaller seam allowance. So if you just cut your pattern pieces out and sewed it on a serger using the raw edge of the fabric, then your garment would be bigger all around. Things like sleeve heads won't quite fit. Other areas where you have to put a circle into another circular shape, they might not fit as well, and you certainly won't get the sizing that the pattern recommends from the finished garment measurements. Here you'll need to take your seam allowance so that it matches your serger, or if you've made this pattern before and you know it fits, so you don't want the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance all the way around, you can redraw the seam allowances so that you can use your fabric more effectively. I'm wearing the Lyra dress today in a cotton poplin. This is the shorter version, so this doesn't have any tiers on. It's got plain sleeves, the collar, the buttons, and of course the pockets. Really easy breezy summer dress, and this pattern has the seam allowances included. The example I'm using is a sleeve pattern, so this is a sleeve pattern without the seam allowances. So for example, you might have traced it off a magazine pattern sheet where there's lots of overlying pattern pieces, and that doesn't include seam allowances. And I chose this because it's got the straight and curved edges to put the seam allowances on. The first thing I'm going to do is the straight one, because that's the easiest one for me to show you. This is from my ruler set, and it's something you might not have spotted before, but the ruler has the measurements running along here, but there's a gap here between that red line and the edge of the plastic, and it is 1.5 centimetres or 5/8. So to put my 5/8 seam allowance along the hemline, I'm going to match up that red line with the sloper line, and I can just keep moving it along to get a straight line at 1.5. Lots of quilters rulers do it too. Depends if you're working in metric or imperial. So I always extend the seam allowance lines off the edge because I don't know where this one's going to come yet. This one's straight as well, so we'll add this one. And this one. So the straight ones are the easiest to do. For the curved edge, we're going to need to put more marks in. So I've got a seam gauge. I'm going to put that on 1.5 centimetres because I was working metric, and mark along the curved edge 1.5 centimetres. On a curve you need to do plenty of dots because you don't want any sort of jaggedy edges. Just in case you didn't know, this is 1.5 centimetres wide, so I can just move the whole of the gauge around and take my measurements. Next, you need to join up those dots. You can use a French curve to get a smooth line. You can use your French curve both ways. Make a connected line all the way along the seam allowance. That's using a seam gauge. You can also try using your dressmaker's tape measure. A tape measure could also be 1.5. Mine is. Double check yours before you use it in that way, but you can use it as a measuring tool just like we did the seam gauge, or you can put it on its side if it's 1.5 centimeters and that's the seam allowance you've chosen, and use that to quickly go around your seam allowance. You don't need a French curve, you can just connect those dots together with a smooth freehand line if you think you can do that really successfully. So those are a couple of different methods. You can use a seam gauge, a flexi tape measure, and a combination with your straight ruler. And then you need to cut your new paper piece out. You might want to draw your seam allowances directly onto the fabric. You can use this Prim chalk wheel. It has a little plastic gauge on the side so you can change for different seam allowances. It's got a wheel that distributes the chalk. And you roll the plastic gauge along the sloper edge, and then the chalk line appears at the increment which you've chosen around the pattern. It's ideal for curves. You don't have to do any marking out like I just did, you can just mark straight on. It's really good if you want to change up how you sew your patterns together. So sometimes you might use a serger, sometimes you might use a sewing machine, so you can change the seam allowances per garment. The bottom slides off and you can take out the cartridge, and this is refillable. You can get a new chalk cartridge to put inside. You can also use it just as a normal chalk without the gauge. You can use it to just mark particular areas of your pattern. You can change that width. So there's numbers on the stem that come out. If you have it really wide, you can make different hem allowances. So that on this sleeve I could do a deeper hem. Then you can cut out your pattern piece. It's only a small thing to worry about, but I hope today has given you a few little tips of how to maybe start that pattern that you have been putting off because you know that the pattern doesn't include seam allowances. You do need to check that when you do your first read of the pattern instructions. It will always say somewhere, even if you can't initially find it, whether seam allowances are included or not and how much they will be. We would love to see what you've been up to in your sewing world. Do make an account with us, share your makes and inspire other Minerva makers. Also, do head over to our YouTube channel where you can check out lots and lots of different content from Minerva. There are sew-alongs, educational ones, learn to sew ones from me, deep dives into new patterns, new fabric releases, and lots of information for new sewers out there too. Thank you very much for watching. See you again soon.